Recording. Hopefully it'll happen. Hello, my name's Paul Humphreys and this is Reophilia, interviews in freshwater science, and I'm very pleased to reconnect, although we haven't really lost connection completely, with Andrew Boulton, Professor Andrew Boulton, who I have known for almost 40 years now, I realise. When I went to,
before we were like this, Paul.
Before we were like this, I had lots of hair in my head and none on my face. And I was at a young honours student actually undergraduate student at Monash University, and Andrew, I think, had just started his PhD. So that was back in the early 80s. So welcome, Andrew.
Thank you very much indeed, Paul. Good on you.
Thanks for agreeing to come on and be grilled. So we might start off with your origins. You're in Western Australia now. You're in Perth.
I am, yes. Yep.
And you started off there, and I wonder if you could tell us what inspired you initially in terms of natural history and ecology and biology and stuff. Was it the Swan River?
The Swan River was certainly near where I grew up, but I have to say that my inspiration probably largely came from my dad, who he grew up in Kenya in Africa, and was one of the founding members of the East African Wildlife Society there, and absolutely fascinated by wildlife. And then when we migrated to Australia, his enthusiasm for Australian wildlife in the 60s, and that at a time that wasn't sort of seen as the draw card it is now. I guess I found that infectious. And he and I, when I was a very small kid, used to go and walk around on rock platforms and look at octopus and stuff. And initially I was fascinated by marine ecology. All of my early studies were marine and estrine.
I can see that.
Loved fishing, and I still adore fishing. And I think a lot of good fishers are good ecologists. Well, not necessarily good ecologists, but they are ecologists. And there's a lot to be said for fishermen's or fishers' insights and the ecological. So my inspiration was very much family, living near water, and a fascination, an obsession with fishing.
I can understand that. I'm trying to draw some parallel. Well, actually, when I was just thinking about it and listening to you, it sort of drew parallels for me with David George Stead. I don't know whether you know. Yeah, and his daughter Christina Stead, who wrote The Man Who Loved Children. And whenever I talk to people about The Man Who Loved Children, they always look at me askance. But I said it's a fabulous book. Based on her father, David George Stead, who was a fish biologist in Sydney area, who took his kids out everywhere. And I still remember that he wrote that he always saying Sunday is fun day. So every Sunday they'd go out and do this sort of stuff, which was absolutely inspiring for them. So it sounds like your father's a bit like that.
He was. And I mean, I think the thing is that we would get up first thing in the morning, the rest of the family would be asleep, and it was just sort of our shared time. To just sort of go down there, as I say, look at the fascination in rock pools, and you could do it day in, day out, and it was always different. You never tread in the same river nor the same rock pool twice.
So this was in Perth.
This was in Perth. Yeah.
But it's a great environment for that, isn't it? It's a wonderful.
And because you've got the Mediterranean climate, we've got a very low tidal range here, so you don't have sort of a couple of meters of tide, 30 centimeters or so of tide. And until probably the 70s, and then the marine heat wave in 2011, there was really a very, very rich marine life around metropolitan Perth. And I remember as a kid, there were octopus everywhere. There were abalone, if you knew where they were, and they were not heavily harvested. And there's been, sort of an interesting switch now where a lot of the limestone rock platforms are now dominated by algae, and there's hardly any of the mollusks, the shells that we used to see, and hardly any octopus. So I think the octopus have all been pretty heavily hammered, except in some of the reef habitat areas. Yeah.
So, okay, so you're interested with marine stuff. You did an honours in the Swan Estuary on shrimp.
On shrimp taxonomy. So what happened, my honours was serendipitous in as much as I, like most kids growing up in West Australia in the 60s and 70s, I went prawning a lot. And I was studying or doing mainly marine biology courses, and I caught some unusual looking shrimps in my prawning net. And so I took them to my lecturer, a fellow called Brenton Knott, and I said, these are not prawns. Do you recognize what they are? And unlike kind of lecturers of today, he said, oh, look, let's look up in the Keys. And he dragged me into his lab, and we sat down and looked at these shrimps under a microscope. And he said, oh, you know, these are different from what they ought to be. And my honours project, which was a systematic one using electrophoresis, ended up looking at the systematics of 4 different species of shrimp.
So tell us what electrophoresis is for those people.
Electrophoresis is it's probably a fairly old technique now, where you separate out proteins by using an electric charge, and it relates to the genetic makeup of different species. And so it's a way of actually using a genetic approach to supplement a shape approach, a morphological approach. Because what we had was shrimps that looked really similar, but they were genetically different. And if you get that kind of evidence, you can kind of tell that you've got different species. But it was also Brenton Knott who said to me, look, you know, lots of people are working on marine stuff. Have you thought about freshwaters? And his PhD supervisor, a fellow called Sam Lake, who he had been supervised by in Tasmania, had just gone to Monash Uni. And he said, why not apply for a scholarship and go over and, you know, do a PhD?
Did you resist that change in environment from marine to freshwater?
Not in the slightest, because working in estuaries, I started to realize that kind of transition zone of not started to realize, I think I'd always been aware of the fact that the river changed when it got flushed by fresh water before the marine influence came up during summer. But I began to sort of suddenly realize that here we were in Australia in the 70s, almost completely obsessed by our marine environment. And yet there was virtually no work being done at all on fresh waters. And when I caught the train across to go to Melbourne to take up my PhD, I remember reading Sam Lake's Jolly Award that the little address that he wrote in 1981. And in it, he sort of said, you know, you can almost be forgiven for thinking there are no running waters in Australia at all, because at that time, there were probably only about 10 or 12 published papers on streams and rivers in Australia.
So you mentioned the Jolly Award. What is the Jolly Award?
The Jolly Award, now called the Australian Freshwater Sciences Society Medal, was named for Hilary Jolly, a New Zealand limnologist who was a real pioneer in all sense of the word in the 50s and 60s. And also one of the very early members of what was then the Australian Society for Limnology. And the award was developed in recognition of her contribution to honour particularly prestigious aquatic.
Had she died or something? Is that what happened?
I don't know. I really don't know whether she'd passed away then or not.
Because certainly when I joined, yeah, I mean, for many, many years, it was the Hilary Jolly Award.
I think many people had no idea it was someone's surname, and I think they thought it was half jokingly referred to the fun of being at a conference. And I always kind of liked the idea of going and listening to someone's Jolly Award.
Yeah, I must admit that I was disappointed when it becomes just a society medal, because that link to people is, to me, is a really a good thing, and it's something that links you with the past and of the society, with the people who were doing the pioneering work, and I think that, yeah, like clearly they were really influential and important people at the time, and just because we don't know as much, we need to learn more about them rather than just.
I think you're absolutely right, and I think meeting the people behind the names has always been one of the most exciting experiences I've had in my career. I mean, I remember, say, meeting someone like Noel Hines for the first time, and he was like your favorite uncle, you know, he was just this incredibly, just avuncular, lovable fellow. And you thought, wow, how's this guy such a legendary scientist, and yet such a good guy.
Mm.
And then you meet lots of other people. Sometimes you're a bit disappointed by what they're like personally versus academically, but it's always, I think you're right, it gives a reality to the facts, to the people behind the facts. Otherwise, you can be so obsessed with the knowledge that you forget that a lot of this is based on someone often working alone or under pretty tough conditions to pull together some of the raw material that led to these facts.
I was fortunate to be in Nebraska in November 2019. Seems like a long time ago, at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. I'm embarrassed I can't remember who the person I was talking to, but I was talking about the origins of the river continuum concept and how I'd wanted to interview Robin Vanote. And then he said, the person I was talking to said, well, it was Wayne Minshall was really one of the driving forces behind this. And one reason why he was a driving force was because Robin Vanote was such an unassuming guy. And I think he might have had sort of some anxiety issues as well, but really did. And, you know, if you look at the number of papers he wrote, it's not a huge number. And he really needed somebody to push him. And I think Wayne Minshall was that person. But that Robin Vanote came up with some of these ideas, and with Wayne Minshall, on trips with bloody Luna Leopold.
Yes, that's
and,
right.
And open this, you know, I just knew nothing of this. I
remember chatting with Bert Cushing about this, because he was also one of the original authors on the river continuum concept paper, which, you know, came out in 1980, and I think had a massive change in the way in which people looked at rivers. I think up till then, people had looked at every river almost alone. And Robin Vanote, if you look at his early work, it was almost entirely on insects and eggs and their biology. And together with Wayne Minshall and Bert Cushing and a bunch of other, you know, then heavy hitters in American ecology, or freshwater ecology, they went to kind of 4 sites on 4 rivers and came up with this river continuum concept, which I think then led to a lot of, you know, thought and debate. Sure, there are drawbacks to it, but as a way of getting people to think more broadly about rivers as systems, it was a phenomenal paper.
Oh, I agree.
And I'd heard, sadly, that you're right about the anxiety with Robin Vanote. He was a postdoc, I understand, when that paper was being put together. And afterwards, you know, there would be a lot of people who used to sort of say to him, look, you know, how did you develop this? What came up? I mean, the pressure when you do something like that must be almost a sort of like celebrities or rock stars.
I think, well, in our field, that you don't get much bigger than that, do you, really?
No, you sure don't. Neither you nor I will ever be that big. You know?
But I was going to say there's an axiom or something, or a saying that says you should never meet your heroes. But I think you're right, and I agree with you, is that virtually all my heroes in our field that I've met have been amazingly generous and wonderful people, even to the point I remember going to a conference, I think it was in Europe, 2000 from memory. It was a big rivers conference, and I think it was Ken Cummins or somebody anyway. It was I went down, you know, bleary-eyed, hungover from the night before, and sat next to this guy because he's the only person in the whole breakfast thing, and he said hello, and we, you know, over your eggs and bacon or something. And I said, oh, what do you do or something? And he looked at me askance and told me his name. And I think I was too even bleary-eyed to realize that I just met royalty. And but even he was, you know, very generous and led me through as a young sort of researcher or something into the field that I should have known off by heart. But
I think you've nailed it, and that is that an awful lot of people, because I would say you could count on the fingers of one hand the folks who have been disappointing when you've met them, and particularly as young callow kind of PhD or postdocs or whatever. And yet these people are very humble, they're very generous with their time. And I mean, even now, all these years later, you can send them an email and, you know, if they're still with us, send them an email and ask them questions about things, and you'll get a reply within 24 hours. And I find it incredible, you know.
And it rubs off, doesn't it? Because I know that it certainly influenced me. Is that if these people are like this, that's who I want to be like.
Yes,
And
yes.
Terry Hillman is a classic example of that too. It's such an incredibly unassuming, humble, generous person that, and I said, I want to be like that.
Yeah.
Probably not, I didn't lose my hair because of that, or I don't want to look exactly like him, but I want to be like him in terms of that sort of the way of treating people. I think that was, and it, it doesn't always happen that way with some fields. Maybe it's just as freshwater scientists or scientists. I don't know. Anyway, we probably should move on.
Yep.
So I got to ask you, had you met Sam Lake before you got there?
Not at all. So I got a Commonwealth postgraduate scholarship, which was the princely sum of about $5,000. And the highlight of that was that you either got an economy airfare or a first class train fare. And so, of course, I opted for the first class train fare across the Nullarbor, loaded my push bike and a suitcase of, clothes.
Sleeper?
Yes, it was.
Must have been.
It was a 3-day trip.
Well, a first class ticket was what the chair went back, right? Just
no, I think there was definitely a sleeper, and certainly some of the best breakfasts I'd ever eaten in my life, So, I mean, I thought this was a brilliant start. Jumped out at Spencer Street Station, managed to persuade a taxi driver to help me tie my bike to the roof of his car. Bear in mind, this is the early 80s, you could still do things like that. Put my suitcases into the back, and then he drove me out to Monash, which was a hell of a good fare. I mean, that was almost as much as the train cost to get across. And then I was introduced to Sam Lake, who I'd never met. And he immediately started chatting about the fishing, Brenton, crayfish, and all the rest of it. And after we talked for about 20 or 30 minutes, I said, about a PhD subject, and we chatted about things I was interested in. And I was very interested in temporary streams, because one of the people who'd had a huge influence on me when I was doing aquatic ecology in WA was a guy called Don Edward, who had worked on temporary rock pools on the top of granite rock outcrops. And we used to lug these mattresses up to the top of this granite rock outcrop, lie on the mattress gazing into the outcrop pool. So it was just like looking into a rock pool, only much more comfortable. And as you watched it, you'd see all this life, all these plankton, all these little midge larvae, dragonflies, and it would be just a tiny puddle of water, maybe no bigger than your kitchen sink full, with all this life in it. And he had studied, primarily interested in the midges, but the community composition of all these things on different rock pools. And I think you had interviewed Brian Timms, who'd also expressed the same wonder at these different sorts of habitats. And so I was really interested in streams that did much the same thing, that flowed and then dried. And I began my PhD in 1982, which happened to be a drought year. I didn't realize it at the time. And so my streams certainly dried.
Well, usually it happens the other way around. Usually what happens is you start an intermittent stream project and it doesn't stop flowing.
Exactly. So I was incredibly lucky to meet Sam, because I think his eccentric enthusiasm and sort of love of what he did totally rubbed off on me. And I mean, here was someone who was also, diverse in interests, keen to meet lots of different people. And, we were talking about big names and what a pleasure it is to meet the person behind the name. I had read pretty well everything by Lake in kind of preparation for this work on...
Was he a big name then?
He was a big name then, because at that time in Australian freshwater ecology, apart from Sam and maybe a couple of people like Terry Hillman and Keith Walker working on the Murray, there was virtually no one else working on running waters in Australia. A lot of the work at that time was either on plankton or salt lakes, with Ian Bailey and Bill Williams, or there was a hell of a lot of fish ecology going on, of course, both on introduced and native fish. And there were, relatively few stream ecologists. He was kind of the main man and continues to be, yes.
Yeah, I just realized I left my cup of tea in another room, but so I was just looking around for that. It's just, just rub it in. Thank you very much.
It's beautiful.
I think I left it in the toilet, actually. Look, Sam just to let people know, Sam taught me third year freshwater ecology or freshwater biology, whatever it was, and was the one who inspired me. I could have gone anthropologically one direction and ecologically the other direction, and I ended up going with Sam, who was my honours supervisor.
In fact, I remember you coming to do honours, and we played this terrible trick on you. In fact, I think you'd injured yourself.
I had, yes.
But we had no mercy. And one day in the marine water table, a starfish had died. And so we took the dead starfish and put it in one of your invertebrate samples. And you were opening it up and pouring it into the sieve when Sam Lake came into the lab. And there's a starfish sitting there. And he looked at it and he looked at us, and then he just walked out, you know. A lesser man would have commented. And you just washed it carefully with water and put it to one side. And well, those were the days. Yeah,
you're right. I had injured I had a motorbike accident and was on crutches for 2 weeks, right at the beginning of my honours. Which, if anybody is listening, don't try to put waders on when your legs in stitches, because it doesn't work very well. You played a bigger trick on me, actually, which is sort of more of a sort of academic trick. You encouraged me during my honours, because I was looking at the biology of this little insignificant fish, a galaxid, and you encouraged me, as part of the dietary thing, was to sample a whole lot of invertebrates, especially chironomids, and squash their heads for weeks and weeks and weeks to identify them. And I never used that data in my thesis at all.
Oh, I never realised that. I'm sorry. It has not intended as a practical joke at all, I'm afraid.
But it has paid off, because I've just had a PhD student who submitted before Christmas, who's been doing paleoecological work in wetlands, temporary and permanent wetlands on the Ovens floodplain here, and 90% of what he picks up is chironomids and head capsules in the sediment. So my sort of career of looking at chironomids is still continuing. So
and you've been able to pass the joke onwards. Yeah.
Right. But the problem is, it's taken 4 years to work out it was a joke. let's not go there. So okay, so you met the wonderful Sam Lake.
Met the wonderful Sam Lake. Did a PhD on 2 temporary streams out west of Melbourne, which ceased flow obviously during the drought, and then 1983-84 was quite a wet year. And I think the main finding out of that was the lagged effects of the drought. A lot of people think droughts have their effect then and there, but it was actually not really all that evident until you saw the changes in recruitment and composition the following year, when there was plenty of flow down the river. But I think the other thing, more as important as the PhD, was just meeting a whole range of other people in another area. In WA at that time, there were only a couple of people doing aquatic ecology. And so the encouragement to go over to Monash, where Sam had set up quite a large group, exposed me to a whole range of other aquatic ecologists. And of course, Ian Bailey was there. And so the combination of Ian Bailey with his interest in plankton and standing waters, and Sam with his interest in community ecology and running waters, it was just a terrific experience.
And Sam had accumulated, by the time I got there in '83 as an honours student, he'd accumulated quite a few PhD students and masters, like Leon Barmuda and Sabina Schreiber.
Yep, Sabine.
Roston Clare, and I'm trying to think of who else, but it was quite a number of. I mean, so when I joined, there was already a full room of you guys there. It was wonderful community to be involved.
And I think then on, Jerry Kloss and Ben Gorn and others came through. So I mean, it was sort of, and I guess different institutions have been like this over the last few years, or over the last few decades. It's kind of, rises and falls, and that network of people you meet in your PhD then continue to be your professional network. And of course, their students get to meet your students. And I think that maintains this whole personal as well as academic network that we were talking about earlier. Yeah.
Yeah, and Sam's PhD supervisor was Alan Weatherly, I gather,
That's right.
at
Yes.
ANU.
His honours supervisor.
Honours supervisor.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
okay. Yeah. Who was his PhD
He
supervisor?
did his PhD, I think, in Southampton on shrimps or some kind of prawn and its endocrine system. It was not the sort of PhD that you would expect a stream ecologist to do.
Yeah.
And perhaps, you know, when you interview him, it would be interesting to ask him about it. But it was I think he went over to the UK to do his PhD. Yeah.
So coming back to your intermittent stream stuff work, I'm curious. So when we have temporary ponds, there's a lot of animals coming out of the sediment when it's really inundated, and obviously some invading from aerially. Where are most of the invertebrates coming from in a temporary stream?
You can't broadly generalize across all temporary streams, but in most of them, most of the invertebrates fly in. Or what you'll often find in quite a few temporary streams is that the groundwater is not that far below. And in fact, a lot of flow in streams is actually driven by groundwater. When the groundwater level rises, that's when you can get what we call base flow, groundwater-driven flow in the streams. And of course, you can also have the situation where isolated pools along a stream are connected by the subsurface flow, what we call hyporheic, hypo meaning under and rheos meaning flow. So underflow connecting these pools together. In terms of the recolonization, surprisingly few animals emerge from the sediments. So part of my PhD work was actually grabbing sediment from these streams and flooding it to see what came out. And compared with what we later on found emerging from, say, dried floodplain sediments around the Murray, and certainly the bed sediments of temporary pools, I think because a lot of the animals in temporary streams are not planktonic so much as insect dominated, a lot of those insects fly in, and also refugial pools, where you get the odd pool lasting along the stream. That's a really crucial refuge for a lot of the recolonists. When
Is that where the crustaceans come from?
Well, you get a few ostracods in streams, little seed shrimps, and I think they wash in as well as emerge maybe from resting stages in the sediments. But because the water's flowing, you don't get a true plankton that you would get.
What about amphipods and things like that?
Amphipods have no desiccation resistant stage at all. So they are purely in standing waters, same with isopods. And of course, your dominant species or your dominant diversity is mainly insects, aquatic insects.
Did you have things like yabbies that would burrow?
I had yabbies, I had amphipods and shrimps, and also these little white isopods with no eyes, which turned out to be living down in the hyporheic zone. And then when the water's filled, a few of them would be, thrown up into the surface water, and I would collect them in my nets or suction samples. And at first, when you see these little white animals, you think, these are a bit odd. And then it turns out that they're, more commonly found in the groundwater, but occasionally accidentally come up into the surface.
So is this, I was going, it's one of the sort of the enduring areas that you've been interested in is the hyporheic. And I was going to ask you where that came from, this interest is sort of under the ground stuff. Is this from your PhD originally?
No, it's not. I mean, the interest in the ground, this was a very incidental discovery when I was doing it in my PhD. My actual fascination with it all arose, and that was that Sam Lake, one of the other things he did, as well as having a big sort of Australian network, was had a huge global network. And he had an American researcher, a fellow called Stuart Fisher, and his wife, Nancy Grimm, come over one time for a conference that Sam had organized. And I met Stuart Fisher and in fact took him out to my study site because Stuart was working on desert streams in Arizona. And I was fascinated by drying and the effects of drying. And at that time, a lot of Stuart's work was on the effects of flash floods and spates. And so we had fascinating conversations about what was going on in our different stream systems. And so Stuart just kind of almost offhandedly said, well, look, you know, you ought to come over to the US sometime. And I thought, yeah, that sounds nice, you know. But I could never see it happening. And of course, this was in the days before internet, and the fax was the most exciting way of communicating things left, right, and center. And so I thought very little more of this, went over to Adelaide for a couple of years. And then while I was in Adelaide, a fax arrived from Stuart Fisher saying, you remember we chatted a few years back? He said, I've been awarded a teaching award, which paradoxically freed him up from teaching. And so he was able to employ me to be a teacher in, in his stead for a year at Arizona State Uni.
Wow. Wow. What an opportunity.
6 months.
Yeah.
So I leapt at it. I, didn't take the push bike this time, but I packed everything up I had in a suitcase and headed over to the US for a year. And the groundwater thing arose this way, that when I arrived, the desert streams had hardly any water in them at all, but there were lots of plastic wells that had been lowered or nailed down into the stream bed. And a lot of Stuart's PhD students were collecting stream water samples because they were really interested in nitrogen and phosphorus and how groundwater and surface water interacted for nitrogen and phosphorus. So because I was a bug guy and didn't know very much about nitrogen and phosphorus, I said, do you ever get any bugs in here? And they said, well, we've never looked. And so I built a little bilge pump device with a tube that I could put down these wells, pumped my heart out of a whole lot of wells, poured the water through into tiny sieves, and there was nothing in it except all these little bits of green gunge. And I said, what's green gunge doing in the underground? Underneath, there's no photosynthesis or something. And they said, oh, that's probably glue. And I said, what do you mean glue? And they said, oh, we glue mesh to the bottom of these pipes so we don't get sand blocking them up and we can collect water samples. So the following day, I knocked some of these wells into the stream bed without the mesh, pumped it up. And I mean, this is sort of one of these Eureka moments. When I pulled the sample out and then added water to it, and I still get a shiver thinking about it, it was seething with all these tiny little groundwater animals, Bathynonations and Syncarids and all these really funky animals I'd never ever come across. And so that whole year's postdoc ended up looking at the diversity of groundwater animals living in the streams.
And were the other people there as impressed and surprised?
Astonished. And I mean, one of the other heroes I met there was a guy called Jerry Cole, who had written, a very early textbook, Cole's textbook on limnology that I had studied as an undergraduate. And Jerry had worked on a lot of these groundwater animals, but he used to go down to Mexico and sample in Mexico for them. And he had a very earthy turn of phrase. And so using a lot of adjectives that I won't use here, he said, who would have thought, that these things were underneath my feet here in Arizona, and there was I going down to Mexico to collect them. But it was very exciting. And I mean, it was sort of something where later on, I mean, there's been a lot more research done on it now, but it really highlighted to me the importance of groundwater surface water interactions, empowering a lot of these streams, and particularly streams with sand beds and gravel beds. That the surface and groundwater are intimately connected, and of course, so too are their fauna and their energy cycle.
And do you feel that nowadays we give that enough credit, or do you think?
I still think we don't. I mean, we certainly give it more than we ever used to. I think that there's been a gradual realization. Initially, everyone was excited about rivers and the river continuum concept. And then people started thinking about the importance of wetlands on the floodplain and the lateral connectivity. And I think it's probably only been in the last decade or two that we've realized the importance of the vertical connectivity with the groundwater as well. So rivers are really these three-dimensional systems where the longitudinal, the lateral, and the vertical dimensions are all crucial in terms of, what lives there, how the energy is cycled, and all the rest of it. In terms of not giving it enough credibility, you only have to look at, say, a lot of the environmental flow work, which is often focused on flows down the surface, along the surface river, without necessarily thinking about, well, what's the effect of these environmental flows on, say, groundwater exchange? Or, if we allow people to withdraw water from the river, It's only been in the last decade or so that we've been much more strict about drawing water from the alluvial sediments too, on the floodplain.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting you say that, because the natural flow paradigm, with whatever the name of that paper that the Roy Prof and others wrote in, I think, 97.
Yes.
And then I was very chuffed to get Ellen Wall's The Natural Sediment Paradigm, I think, paper, which I think is only 5 or 6 years old now, basically saying, and I agreed when I reviewed the paper completely, that, you know, ignoring sediment in the process while thinking about just water flow is it's ludicrous.
Absolutely, yeah.
But it's taken that long for this to happen.
And I mean, Ellen's been saying those sorts of things for, you know, for a couple of decades, and
yes.
you know, she's done some phenomenal stuff in the sediment mechanics. And one of the things that struck me with the Sonoran Desert streams is that because they're a much finer sediment, when a flash flood goes down, it completely reams the stream. I mean, it totally reorganizes the stream bed. These brand new gravel bars form, trees disappear, or the seat willows, the little willows along the edge. And of course, you might be thinking, well, if the gravel's getting reworked, what kind of environment is that for these groundwater critters, these hyporheic animals? After a while, it seems that they've just gone much deeper. There's probably been a lot lost in the flood, and then they come back up. And of course, these freshened sediments are almost like the sand bed filter in a water filtration treatment. And so all the microbes and bacteria coating these sand grains and gravel grains are the food source for these animals down in the groundwater. And then, you know, in turn, because you get upwelling and downwelling zones along the stream, that exchanges energy upwards and downwards into the stream. When you wade along a desert stream in bare feet, which is a really pleasant thing to do, you can feel the cold and warm water as groundwater wells up and down. So it's very handy to know this, so that if you're taking cold beers down to the stream and you don't have a cooler, you can put your beers in an upwelling zone where the cold groundwater keeps them cool and go swimming in the warm
What
water.
temperature difference are we talking about?
10, 12 degrees.
Oh, really?
Serious temperature differences, yeah.
Wow. I was wondering, I mean, I often think about sort of the history of science and the history of sort of exploration of particular areas. And I think that for me, I thought about this, is that, you know, I should say, sort of European descriptions and introductions of species of fish in Australia to the scientific establishment in overseas took quite a lot longer than birds and mammals. And I think, I'm just speculating here, is that the aquatic environment is very foreign to humans. We have to physically and sort of philosophically and psychologically get into a different environment, something where we can't breathe, we can't see very well, and all that sort of stuff. So we actually have to immerse, literally and figuratively, ourselves in this new environment. It takes time, and not everybody wants to do it because it's uncomfortable often the case. And we also do it. We do it because there's fish in there too. We get attracted to fish. You're a fisherman, you like it. But then to go even further down takes another step, and probably an even bigger step below at the sediment level, below the sediment level to the hyporheic.
And it's not, you're absolutely right. It's not an accessible environment, really. I mean, you need specialized equipment. And I mean, knocking in bores, for example, particularly for the very deep groundwater. I mean, I'm talking about the stuff that I was doing with plastic bores. They were going down maybe 1 to 2 meters. The work that's done on true groundwater fauna, what people call stygofauna, from the stygo, you know, the Hades, the depths, you know, those are often bores that have been sunk either for groundwater, for agriculture, or for mining or whatever. They're not cheap to put down. And that whole out of sight, out of mind syndrome, I think, is very prevalent in groundwater. And of course, it then comes to conservation. I mean, we're very passionate about conserving marine and surface aquatic life, you know, environments and habitats. But there's not a hell of a lot of attention focused now on maybe a protected groundwater area. We have some springs in the Great Artesian Basin that are protected, and quite a few stygofaunal communities are protected. but it's in a very piecemeal sort of way. We protect an isolated area where a bit of groundwater comes up to the surface. But in terms of thinking about protecting its recharge area or the whole area to get the surface and the subsurface connected systems together, means that any groundwater dependent ecosystem also has to be included and protected at the same time.
Yeah.
I think you're absolutely right. I think this whole idea of a kind of dawning awakening of, our environment around us. And it's not just spatial, it's size related as well. I mean, we're only now beginning to appreciate the importance of the little things that run the world, as E.O. Wilson said, and the importance of microbes and viruses.
But it sort of reminds me of a couple of things. It reminds me a little bit of those old telemercials, or what do they call them? It's like, as an ecologist, it's like, you've won all this, you get all this stuff for $29.99 and then say, but wait, there's more. And they give you the steak knives, but wait, there's more. And it's like, as an ecologist, at some stage you think, right, that's the end of it. And then somebody says, well, there's actually animals living below the surface of rivers, sediment in the rivers. Oh,
I
really?
don't think we ever say that's the end of it. I think it's something where, as an ecologist, you spend your entire life realizing that you do not know the full story.
But then you have to convince managers and they go, what? I mean, we have enough difficulty conceptualizing a surface flow in a river, let alone something that's way down there. We could go on about management and that sort of stuff for a while, but I want to keep going a bit with you. So you went across and worked with Stuart Fisher and Nancy Grimm, and you uncovered, I don't know what the word is there, uncovered this new area, and you're still publishing in that sort of area, I see.
Still working in that. And I mean, the other thing that was also great, and that was because the other postgraduate students in Nancy and Stuart's lab were working on, nutrient and surface water issues. And I think this was one of the big pluses of having multiple people working on single stream systems like the Sonoran Creek, Sycamore Creek. And that was that, trained as a community ecologist and then going working with Stuart and Nancy, who would describe themselves as ecosystem ecologists, helped me start to see the big picture. And working with people like Emily Stanley and Maury Vallette opened my eyes to how the interactions between the kind of community composition of the invertebrates I was finding related to the nutrient dynamics and patterns that they were finding, and also to the hydrology. And I began to realize, the overriding importance of stream and subsurface water hydrology. And so I think one of the things you find as an ecologist is you're also having to learn a very healthy amount of other disciplines, the physical sciences, in order to understand and try and explain pattern, and of course then go on and predict it, so that later on you can say, well, look, if a flood goes through and it reorganizes the stream in this way, then this will be the kind of nutrients you'll find. This is what the algae will do. This is what the bugs will do. And I think that then ties into helping managers predict what will happen when they do stuff. At the early stage when we're simply describing it, it's a little bit too early to be able to predict it. And yet, of course, the managers want those predictions. And so there's this constant catch up where you're trying to make sure that the information you're giving managers is as reliable as possible. And yet you're also aware of the fact that there are holes, and you're hoping those holes are not so dramatic that they might lead to very wrong decisions.
So how long did you spend in the US all up?
12 months. My visa was 12 months. I arrived there almost on the 2nd or 3rd of January, and no one told me how cold Arizona would be in the middle of winter. I had watched a lot of Westerns. So I thought I was pretty well prepared for what Arizona would be like. And then, tail end of December, after going through the whole Thanksgiving and white Christmas thing, then back, and I took up a postdoc in Adelaide, working on the Flinders Ranges, which was the closest for me then, relatively accessible analog, if you like, to the Sonoran desert streams. And so straight away, I started looking for subsurface fauna there, for hyporheic fauna there. And there was plenty there.
Who was supervising your postdoc?
It was comparatively unsupervised. On paper, it was Mike Geddes.
Right.
But Mike would be the first to admit that basically He organised the paperwork for me, and then I was
You are uncontrollable.
uncontrollable. But I was there at the time. I mean, Bill Williams was there, Keith Walker was there, Mike Geddes, Mike Cockin was another postdoc who'd done a lot of work on plankton. So there was no shortage of great aquatic support. And of course, having a postdoc with a relatively poorly defined project allowed me to just explore lots of...
Those were the days.
Those were the days.
And
Not the most efficient of days, but they were very pleasant.
Can I ask you? Look, one of the papers that I think stands the test of time and hasn't been surpassed in many ways is a paper that you and Lance Lloyd did. I think 1991. I think it was Boulton and Lloyd, where you was this at the time? So this was the time around when you did that work where you flooded or you inundated soils from different...
That's right. And I mean, so that was with Lance Lloyd, and it was some work that I'd actually done straight after my PhD. And I gave a talk at the ASL meeting, what was the precursor to Australian Freshwater Sciences meeting. And I was talking about all these ordination plots from a PhD data. It was as boring as anything. And of course, everyone was falling asleep, including Bill Williams, who was sitting in the front row of the seats.
Right.
And I don't know what made me say it. It was a spontaneous and foolish thing, but I said something silly as I was talking, like, and Bill Williams ought to be listening to this as well, because I think analysing his salt lake data using these ordination plots would be a good thing to do. And Bill shook awake, and I thought, I've ruined my entire future career in Australia now through insulting this absolute legend. After my talk, I went to apologise to Bill, and I said, look, I'm so sorry. It was just a random spur of the moment thing. And he said, no, he said, I think you're right. He said, I was asleep and it was boring, but he said, I'm really interested in these multivariate techniques you're using. Why not come to Adelaide and maybe, lecture? Because I lectured for 2 years after my PhD before I took up the US postdoc. And that was purely Bill, who I had insulted shamefully.
Just goes to show you. People don't give you jobs.
Well, again, those were the days. Nowadays, they give you, lots of grief and you'd be behind bars. But Bill, true to his word, allowed me to ordinate living daylights out of a lot of his Salt Lake data sets. And so I worked with Keith Walker and others on doing these ordinations as well. But it was really, so back to Lance Lloyd. I had no grant money, and the Royal Society said, if grants, we will allow $500, for grants. And that was enough for us to hire a vehicle to drive out to the Chowla floodplain on the Murray, buy some ice cream containers and a little bit of alcohol, and to preserve the invertebrates. Anyway, Lance Lloyd, who knew the Murray really well, and I had been involved with Lance a little bit, helping him with some of his fish sampling there. He said, look, I know some places where there are different flooding histories. So we worked those out from aerial photographs. And then we went and dug up all these sediments, coarse sediments, dropped them all into ice cream containers. And then in my little office, I set up all these pots, flooded them, and then just kept repeatedly sampling them, not expecting everything to come out. And because my office was quite close to the tea room, people like Russell Shield would come walking by for a cup of tea and then look in the pot, and where I thought I might have only 10 different species of rotifer, he'd say, no, sorry, mate, you've got about 30 or 40 that I can see there, and there's probably another 500 undescribed. And so that was when I began to realize, this massive diversity. But that was purely a little one-off grant funded by the Royal Society. And then Keith Walker was the fellow who encouraged me to publish it with Lance and put it in Regulated Rivers, which was the journal before it became River Research and Applications.
Often, sometimes the best bits of work, I think, are done on shoestrings like that, just off the sort of
and entirely serendipitous. I mean, I had been inspired, I think, back with flooding sediments up on these rock pools that I was telling you about earlier with Don Edward. And I guess even before then, as a kid, reading comics where they used to have these pictures on the back of the comics that showed sea monkeys. And a little
Yes.
circus and all these things swinging in that. So I'd always been fascinated by things coming out of dry sediments. And then at that time, Mike Geddes had a postdoc student called Philip Aramagam, I think.
Yes, yes.
And he was...
I've got his thesis in the bookshelf behind me.
Okay, well, he was really interested in what small fish eat. And I said to him, well, surely if small fish are coming out on the floodplains, maybe they're eating all these newly hatched invertebrates that are coming out of the freshly inundated floodplain. And it kind of became an unsupported paradigm. I mean, we had no evidence for it, but Phil's fish, because what they could eat was limited by their mouth gape size. I looked at the kinds of small fish that would be used in the floodplain, looked at their potential gape size and the size of these rotifers and little plankton coming out, and just kind of, you know, posed the idea. And of course, like a lot of speculative ideas, you know, sometimes they got more credence than perhaps they deserved. But it also sort of led to, you know, research directions into what fuels larval fish spread and feeding on floodplains. Yeah.
Oh, look, I love all that stuff, and it's, you know, it's hypothesis that people go out and test, and no, that's the way it should be. No, it's just a bit of work that I think I've probably referred to on almost every paper I've ever written, just because nobody has looked at that very much, and that side of things, and in terms of the flooding histories, and it's a shame that hasn't more been done of it. So you were back.
Although Kim Jenkins went on, and you know, terrific PhD looking at you know, this in far more detail in the Darling, and a lot of work arising out of that. And I know there've been, I mean, I know you've had students, and you know, there are people working up at UNE.
Yeah, Daryl Nielsen, worked with Daryl Nielsen here, has been done stuff, of course, with Margie Brock, and which segues quite nicely. So after your Adelaide experience, your second time, how did you end up? Was it after that you ended up in UNE?
After that, I ended up at University of New England. So again, I was coming to the end of my postdoc, and having a postdoc is a double-edged sword. I mean, it's kind of nice to go and do these things, but you'd really like a permanent job. And I was at, again, another ASL conference, and I blame Margaret Brock entirely. We were sitting drinking red wine at a conference dinner, and she said, there's a job coming up at University of New England. And I had no idea where Armidale University of New England was, and I'd never been to New South Wales. And she said, oh, you ought to apply for it. And so I sort of said, yeah, and we drank more, and I thought nothing more of it. Anyway, a little bit later, I thought, oh, maybe I probably should, because there were no other real
Hang on, how old were you at this stage?
20... That's a good question. 34. I went to the US when I was 30, so I was 34.
So you'd never been to New South Wales when you were 30?
Never been to New South Wales when I was 34, yeah.
Unbelievable.
So I'd been all around West Australia. I'd been all around South Australia. I'd been all around Victoria. Never been to... I might have gone to New South Wales a couple of times for ASL conferences, but that was it. Never done any research there.
Yeah. Okay.
Never,
Been to Arizona, but I haven't been to New South Wales.
All right, now you're putting it like that, you know. I thought these were interviews, not insults, anyway.
Well, it's just the way you said it. It's like, you know, I've never been out of, I don't know.
I had never done research in New South Wales before.
All right, so
anyway, I flew up there for the interview, and it was fantastic. I loved Armidale, and certainly the people straight away. And the university was small. It was very different from any of the city universities I'd ever taught at, in as much as people seemed to have a real genuine, you know, love of the local area and what they were doing. And it was very clear that it was a university town, and there was something really kind of rather nice about that too. But it was really the people I met. You know, there was a lot of enthusiasm about the new job and a new department sort of expanding, and I think there were about 3 or 4 new hires while I was there. And yeah, I was lucky enough to get the job. Headed up there and started teaching. And that was my first exposure to external teaching as well as internal teaching. So internal teaching, I'd always given lectures to students in a class. And when I arrived there, they said, you'll be teaching aquatic ecology, replacing a fellow called John Weir. Now, John Weir had been one of the very early aquatic ecologists in Australia who had done a lot of work overseas and in Indonesia and Africa. But his main interests in Australia seem to be largely in malaria and various kinds of diseases and stuff. So I looked at all his early lecture notes, which were all on yellowed overhead sheets, all about malaria. And I thought, I think I might teach a slightly different course. And so in a very frenetic year or so, I wrote a whole set of lecture notes drawing heavily on material I'd come across in the US, obviously on Sam and Ian Bailey's lectures, on the stuff I'd learned in WA. And
but there was no, can I say there was no textbook at that stage that people could use?
Well, there was Bailey and Williams, of course. So Bailey and Williams was written in the 1970s, I think. And so there was no real textbook. And I mean, for my undergraduate work, I had used Cole's textbook, which was a US textbook, Brian Moss's textbook, which I taught from. And Bailey and Williams was not so much really a textbook that one taught a course from. It just had a lot of really interesting material on Australian and New Zealand waters.
Yes.
And so I wrote this set of external notes, which was in a way a precursor to a textbook. And I used that for a couple of years until one day, one of my external students came in and said, are you aware of the fact that one of your previous external students is distributing your sets of external notes for anyone who wants to use them as a source material for all the information about Australian aquatic systems? And I have to say I was mildly outraged. So I went to the university and I said, is there anything much we can do about this? And they said, no, just wear it. And it was actually Bill Williams who came to the rescue again. He at that time had a publishing business called Glen Eagles Publishing in Adelaide. And he said, why don't you and Marg write a textbook and I'll publish it for you. And so I broached the topic with Marg, and because, so
tell us who Margie Brock is.
Okay, Margaret Brock is an aquatic ecologist, a plant biologist and botanist, and also really interested in temporary waters. And so she had also done a lot of work on her PhD supervised by Bill Williams. So you can see this very incestuous link here in terms of how our supervisors dictate our futures and how we then dictate others. And so Marg said, look, that's a great idea. And she said, we can actually have a chapter in this book on temporary waters. And so we can focus on all the things about Australian waters. And so when you read overseas textbooks in aquatic ecology up until quite recently, they hardly talked about temporary streams or intermittent rivers or, temporary waters. Whereas we were able to focus on having, covering these topics of really common water bodies in Australia. The other thing that was fantastic was that we also invited a whole bunch of our colleagues, aquatic ecology colleagues across Australia, to contribute little boxes. And I think I might have pressed you to put together one on larval fish or some such.
Something like that.
And it was fantastic. Everyone wrote these beautifully eclectic boxes that we could slot into all the relevant topics, so that when students were reading the book, they could also see little, personal vignettes, if you like, from various researchers in that field, and get a feel that this is not just facts and figures. There are actually people out there, collecting larval fish in the Murray, or, sampling crayfish or whatever it might be. And so I think that combination of the boxes, of the lack of a textbook available, of how cheap it was because Bill published it. And so, the copies were selling at a fraction of most other textbooks because it was quite heavily subsidized, I guess. That was really a fantastic experience.
And a lot of work, as I know, with these things.
It was a brutal amount of work. As you know. Yes, yeah.
So what Is it like childbirth in the sense that you forget after a while how much work it is, and then when you did the revision a few years ago?
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak about what childbirth is like, but I never forgot how much work it was. I mean, in a way, if I'd not gone through all the work to pull together the external notes, I certainly would not have sat down and said one morning, "Oh, I'm going to write a textbook." No way. And in a way, the collaboration with Margie Brock was really important too. It's not a book that you would write on your own, but having other people who've got other fields and disciplines. And of course, her husband, Peter Jarman, who proofread, you know, both the original version and the revised version, were massively important. No, the revision arose because although I had retired by then, I'd retired in 2007, and the revised, the second edition came out in 2014. People like Jenny Davis particularly, and also Belinda Robson and others kept saying, "When's another edition coming out?" And of course, Marg and I would look into our glasses of wine and say, "No, never, you know, it's an awful lot of work." And of course, in that time, so that book came out in 1999, between 99 and 2013, the year before publication, there'd been that much work done on Australian freshwaters. It was now a massive field. I mean, there were so many other topics to cover, and yet you didn't want the textbook to blow out. So we had to kind of really kind of restrain ourselves. It was motivated very much by the enthusiasm of the co-authors. And then a fellow called Ward Cooper at Wiley said, "Look, we'll publish it for you." And so the fact that it also had a much wider distribution through Wiley Publishing was another big plus. And then, so we ended up with 6 co-authors on the book. So Darren Ryder, Jane Chambers, Belinda Robson, Margie Brock, Jenny Davis, and myself. And there it is, that's the one. And of course, that front cover picture and a lot of the fantastic photographs in there are courtesy of Jenny Davis and her partner, you know, quite spectacular. And so, yeah, it was actually a comparatively easy exercise, you know, when everyone sort of chipped in and took on sections and chapters to write. And then we collated it and published it. And although I've never used the book in anger, I've never taught from it, I've been really heartened by the number of people who've sort of said, "Yep, this is a good book, we use it."
Yes, I remember distinctly when you were finishing and that the second edition, and we were waiting for it to come. And Robin Watts and I here at Charles Street University were about to teach our semester for the subject, river ecology subject we're doing. And I think from memory, you might have given us the first few chapters or something. I don't know, but we had photocopies for the students because we're still waiting for that to come out to be printed.
No, I think I remember that. Yes, yes. Right,
and we still use it. I still use it. I'm just about to start teaching.
The book or the photocopies?
No, the book.
Oh, good. Oh, that's good. Yeah.
It's actually at the moment it's propping up a lamp, but it will be used in anger, as you say, at some stage very soon.
But I think the other thing too is that, I mean, you know, we're now 2021. Another couple of years, that book will be 10 years out of date. I'd be thrilled if someone else sort of said, "Look, it's now another time." I mean, there have been so many massive advances in our understanding in the last decade. I know now with the advent of teaching on the internet and all the different sorts of things you do that maybe textbooks are passé, but I think there's still value in producing books.
I don't think that. Well, I don't think they're passé. I mean, I've used for my subjects. I usually have got textbooks, or all of them actually. I use textbooks, and there's a particular book, you know, the prescribed book, which I find very useful. And I think one of the reasons you find it useful is because it's got a structure that you can follow, and you can point at each time. But it seems like they've still got a place. There's some interactive stuff which online, which is really useful, and figures and stuff that you can get, which help. But I think my students seem to find it, still find them useful. So.
Well, there's a challenge that when you've finished your COD book,
no
there
way.
must be someone out there who'd be keen to do it.
No, I don't think I could ever have the patience to to do a second edition of.
It's an immense amount of work, and I mean, I remember even sitting down and doing all the indexing and going through and checking all the references and stuff. I mean, those things just take days and days and days.
Yeah. No, it's a massive achievement, and I think that's interesting to, when we did our fish book, to realize that you've been, again, I did that for the same reason, is in many ways is like you cobble together all sorts of things when you're trying to teach something, and then you realize that, well, at some stage somebody's gonna have to put this stuff together, and why not me? I think at the end of it you go, well, I know why not me, because it was such a big thing, but it's kind of fun in some ways, and I enjoy the process of writing. I don't think I enjoy the process of editing as much as I do of writing, which is not.
I think too, Paul, and this goes back to our earlier discussions about the generosity of our research field. I mean, like, I think what encouraged all of us when we were doing that second edition, and also the first edition when Margie and I were working on it, and that was everyone's enthusiasm and encouragement. Our colleagues, that also, how's the book going, which is equivalent to how's the thesis going, the worst thing you ever want to hear as a postgrad student. But it was sort of something where people would be contributing little snippets, sending photographs. After the first edition came out, a couple of people said, hey, there are a couple of bits that you haven't quite got right. And so we were able to use those in the second edition. People who willingly sort of looked through sections and made sure they were okay. And all of that gratis, and it was just incredible support. So I think if you've got a research field or a discipline where people are willing to contribute those sorts of things as well, it makes these massive exercises a hell of a lot easier. I feel as if that book should have 200 authors, not just 6.
No, I can believe it, with all those boxes in there. I think that's a great thing to have. I mean, I found that very useful, and as you say, the students seem to connect with that sort of stuff. It's not just a couple, 2 or 3 people or whatever, it's a whole lot of people, and they realize there's a much bigger field of people working in this area than just a few. You wrote the first edition when you were at UNE.
Yes.
While you were teaching and stuff, as you say. So you say you retired even before you have turned 50. Yeah. So what, I mean, that's a fairly unusual thing to do, a prestigious position at a regional university, doing well, being paid a salary at the professorial level, I think, and everything. What makes one retire at that age?
It's not for the faint-hearted, and it's not a decision that I probably gave enough thought to, but it was really one of those sort of spontaneous things where my partner at the time was head of department in education in the School of Education at UNE. I had elevated, as you say, up to a professor level by then. And I was finding the things that I really enjoyed, like the teaching and going out on the field work and, working with my postgrads and all the rest of it, were increasingly being replaced by, administration or applying for grants and all the rest of it. And so it was really one of these sort of decisions where over dinner, over a glass of wine, both Deb and I looked at each other and kind of almost said to each other, we've kind of had enough, And it was really Deb's courage where she said, well, I could leave tomorrow. And when I kind of put, once the idea sort of set seed, we thought, well, yeah, there's lots of other things that we could be doing. Neither of us had, dependents that we had to maintain. Houses in Armidale weren't extremely expensive, and so we'd almost paid our house off in Armidale. So there was, there was no financial burden. And so...
But you had no salary to go to.
Had no salary to go to, no job to go to. There were lots of rumours that came out when I said, look, I'm leaving, they said, oh, you've been snapped up for some, ARC fellowship somewhere prestigious. And I said, no. But I was delighted by how elevated the rumours were. I thought, well, that's really nice, but none of these.
United Nations has called you.
And so we had both planned to just simply go back to Adelaide and live with, my partner's father there for a while. And then I figured I'd eventually come back home to Perth and look after my old dad. And that was about the grandness of the plans. And then as kind of serendipitously happens, the editor of Marine and Freshwater Research, a guy called Dougal McLashan, I had been on the editorial board for quite a few years, and he said, look, I'm stepping down and we're looking for a new editor. Would you be interested in editing the journal? So I went down to CSIRO Publishing in Melbourne and met up with the editorial team there, including the technician who had worked for Sam Lake when I had gone there for a
Dave
PhD,
Morton.
a fellow called David Morton, who, when I went in, said, Andrew. And so, I mean, and I'd always called him Uncle Dave. And so I think a lot of people in Collingwood, in CSIRO Publishing, thought we were related, because he hugged me and said, nephew, and I said, uncle, you know. But I mean, he was now, you know, a big wheel with CSIRO.
When he got that job, I mean, I heard he got that job because it was, I probably shouldn't reveal too much, but I just remember when he was Sam's technician, and maybe I just put it kindly, is he used to help Sam write his papers a bit.
And also he had an amazing eye for error. And
yeah.
I mean, the story I'd heard, I don't know if it's true or not, but that was at his interview, he cast his eye across a pamphlet that happened to be on the table, which was advertising some product from CSIRO Publishing, and said, oh, by the way, there's a typo there. And they looked and there was, you know, and he still got this absolutely sort of, you know, motor mind to hold all these thoughts and ideas together. So for me, editing marine and freshwater research was a really nice transition. It was obviously a fractional salary, but as I say, the salary and the finances weren't super important then. And we sold our place in Armidale and lived with Deb's dad. And
did you enjoy the job editing the journal?
Initially, yes, later, no. So I think the two things that I found exhausting about editing the journal was the kind of the relentless onslaught of manuscripts. Even over Christmas, you'd have people sending you manuscripts on Christmas Day, which to me just seemed unhealthy. And also I hated rejecting papers. So while I was working with the journal, the impact factor almost doubled, and the submissions went up from about 150 odd a year to about 600. Whoa. And yet at that time, before we had fully transitioned to electronic journal, we could only publish maybe a couple of hundred. And so when you have to reject 2/3 of the papers in a journal as broadly titled as Marine and Freshwater Research, it was really quite a, you know how much work it involves for someone to put together a paper. And so it was really quite a grueling and, you know, anxious process. Having said that, though, I was also really lucky again with a huge group of associate editors who worked very, very hard in reviewing and finding, you know, referees and that. And I think one of the things I also found out as an editor was how hard it is sometimes to find good referees.
Oh, yeah.
Nowadays, with so many constraints on people's time, most people decline to review a paper. And of course, what that inevitably happens is that you go down the pecking order of preferred referees. So you contact 2 or 3 hotshots. No, sorry, we're too busy. You go further down. And eventually you're actually getting your referees. I'm not saying they're not all experienced, but some of them are not as experienced as the experts you'd like to be able to tell you. And
yeah.
so
I've had that. I was going to say, I just, over Christmas, I'm an associate editor on the journal, and I think it was about the 8th, I think I sent it to 8 or 10 people before I got 2 referees to agree to it. Now it turned, they're really good referees, as it turns out, but wow, that was, you know, it's really eking out the whole process by months and months because you're waiting for these people to say no.
So you think to yourself, as an associate editor, the complexity of finding 10, you know, 8 to 10 people, multiply that by a few hundred manuscripts in a whole bunch of different topics. So I was having to expand my knowledge into marine and estuarine stuff quite swiftly as well, and going to marine conferences and, you know, soliciting papers and meeting up with people to be potential referees or associate editors. And it, as I say, it's relentless. And so I was deeply relieved in, you know, when Max Finlayson came along and said, look, I'm willing to take over. And by that time, after 5 years, I think I was burned out as an editor.
So, so that you said it was a fractional time, so it wasn't a full-time job.
Well,
What ended up being
it was a
full-time?
full-time job for me.
Yeah.
But I mean, my salary was an order of magnitude less than I had been on. Luckily, I enjoy fishing, so I wasn't quite reduced to tins of beans and that. And also, I had another career in writing, which brought a little bit of money in. But I guess the main thing out of that was realizing that a lot of people who are even associate editors, if they're handling, say, 10 to 12 papers a year, I don't know how many you handle, but seeing that through, that eats up a large chunk of your time. And most people who are associate editors are also employed full time. I find it very hard to believe someone could edit a journal and be employed in another job. I found it a full-time job, and that was even with a very, very competent editorial assistant and a fantastic team of associate editors and all the rest of it. And of course, I was co-editing with another editor, Keith Hunter, who handled a lot of the marine nutrient and chemical papers. But even so, it's a massive workload. And so that's why I suggest people be very kind to editors and treat them gently, even if they do reject your papers.
No, I think when you're you come at these things from different angles, you realize you tend to be much more generous, I think, in your thoughts. My PhD supervisor, Ian Potter at Murdoch University in Western Australia, was a great teacher for all sorts of reasons. And he taught me how to review papers. And the first thing he said to me was, he said, when you get a paper, just remember this person's probably spent 3 years of their life doing this piece of work. And if you start off with, this is a load of rubbish, it's not a good way to approach that. So you always look for the good parts of work. And I think it was one of the best things that's ever been said to me, is always look for the good stuff, highlight that, and then,
and then the but.
And then the but, yes.
But I think, Paul, you raise a key point, and that is that a lot of the early career researchers, and I mean, they truly have spent 3 to 5 years putting these papers together. When they first tentatively pluck up the courage, and it takes a bit of guts to put your work out for review into a journal, and particularly if you've had a hands-off supervisor who's not necessarily helped you write or put stuff together, if they get a savage rejection or a chewing out for a major revision for their first 2 papers, or first 1 or 2 papers, it would be dreadful to consider that might actually change someone's career. They might even decide, well, look, I don't want to work on this anymore. I'm going to go and do X or Y or pull out of the field altogether. And so one of the things I have always been acutely aware of, and certainly when editing MFR, and that was putting a lot of extra effort into early career researchers and helping them put their papers together. And, I still do run writing workshops to help people craft and think through how to review a paper, because that often doesn't get taught. How to write and structure a paper, how much makes a paper, how much is too much, how much is too little. Having a kind of, a sort of publishing portfolio where you think about, well, what do I need to publish and when, what order should my papers come in? And then, which journals, choosing a journal. There are so many things where you can get really poor advice and you can take great bits of work that you bury in a wrong journal, or, submit your work to savaging by sending it to Science or Nature before publishing it later in a more modest journal. So
well, they just ping it before you don't even see. There's no review because they say it's just not good enough, whatever.
You find out within a minute of submission.
Yeah, I know how that feels. Okay, so the last 5 years.
So the last 5 years. So I think one of the things is that you would think that as a retirement, you'd spend a lot of time looking forward to endless mornings on the beach fishing and maybe the afternoons bowling down at the local bowling green or something like that. But one of the things that I was extraordinarily lucky about, and that was one of my PhD students, a lady called Moya Tomlinson, finished her PhD on groundwater. and then went off and worked in Canberra for a group that was assessing the impacts of coal mining and coal seam gas extraction on coal mines. So they were looking at environmental impact statements as an independent group of expert scientists, and then advising the government as to, you know, whether further research was further environmental assessment was needed, what areas were a little bit sort of inconclusive, what conditions should go ahead if the mining were to go ahead. And she called me up and said, look, we've got to do some research assessments on some of these bits of work. Would you be interested in coming and having a look at it? So she flew me, or Canberra flew me over, and I spent a bit of time working with her on some of the research aspects, supporting the Independent Expert Scientific Committee. And I got really lit up that here were a group of really dedicated scientists who were taking all this scientific knowledge across a range of disciplines and almost acting as a set of referees or peer reviewers, if you like, of environmental impact assessments, and providing measured guidance to proponents and to government regulators as to where the flaws or faults might be. So you may have a groundwater model that might be great for groundwater, but not very good for predicting ecological impacts. And so, you know, these kinds of mismatches need to be picked up by an independent group looking at these sorts of things. And so in 2014, I was invited to join the committee. And so I've been on this committee, you know, since 2015, working with groundwater hydrologists, geologists, ecotoxicologists, a whole range of different disciplines. And that's been fantastic because I've been able to keep up with the research, and also every month or 6 weeks, sit down with this group of researchers, either virtually like we are, or in person in Canberra or in different places, to talk with the regulators about what questions they need answering, to talk with consultants and proponents as to how do you do the most efficient and effective environmental impact assessment, and how do we get our cake and eat it? I mean, if we are going to use coal and coal seam gas, how do we minimise the impacts, the inevitable impacts there'll be on, you know, aquatic environments or other sort of environmental situations? And in an odd kind of way, it's been everything that I've enjoyed at the university. It's been research, it's been teaching, because you're teaching, you know, government bureaucrats and regulators, and in a way each other. I mean, I learn as much from the rest of the committee as, or in fact more perhaps, than they learn from me. And so there's this kind of, finally at the end of my career, putting all these bits together and sort of helping, I hope, make a difference.
So you say the end of your career. I was, so are you still going with this?
Still going with the committee. My tenure is up for review middle of this year, so who knows what happens after June of this year. But yeah, it's because it's a 3-year rolling.
So do you have what is the next thing? Do you have any plans?
No.
Great.
Sorry.
No, that's okay.
I mean, things come up. I'm also involved with the shale gas, on the panel assessing the effects or potential effects of shale gas extraction up in the Beetaloo and the Isa Basin, again, as part of, you know, a Canberra review panel. And I've been doing a little bit of work with CSIRO lately, assessing potential cumulative impacts upon the Greater Blue Mountains area. So, I mean, all of now and again, just little jobs come up, and if they look fun, I'll take them. And
so do you actively seek those out, or is it really more about,
entirely word of mouth, or you know, someone will say, "Oh, do you know a bit about this or that?" And
because I think that, I mean, you know, I think that I remember when Keith Walker retired from University of Adelaide, and he was a bit concerned. I remember talking to him, a bit concerned about sort of being on a bit of on the scrap heap and taking on probably a bit too much with the endangered species unit or whatever it was that he was doing, which was a big job. And there's that sort of feeling of having been useful for quite a long time and then potentially not being useful that people have. And I know it affects me. I'm 58. not thinking of retirement anytime soon, but there's a lot of aspects of the teaching and everything else that weighs you down.
It's a well-known syndrome. It's a relevant syndrome. And there are, and I mean, you and I both know colleagues who have pulled the plug, stepped away. I mean, James Ward is a classic example of someone who was an absolute shining star for many decades in aquatic ecology, and then appeared to disappear off the face of the planet. And then similar vintage, someone like Jean Likens, who is still actively involved in working with, you know, doing consulting work and mentoring people and all the rest of it. I think that obviously it differs, personal circumstances and health and all the rest of it. But in a way, if you are on people's radar and you help the best you can, and particularly electronically now, I mean, once upon a time, you had to go and see people face to face and say, could I work for you? Could I do something? Now people can just email you and say, hey, you interested? And so you might say, well, give me a little bit more detail. And then you look at it and think, nah, not really. I'll say no to this one, but please keep me in mind. Or, hey, look, I think I could help you. I could do this, this, and this.
And what about co-supervision of PhD students and things like that?
Well, I'm an adjunct professor at Uni of New England, and so I can still be involved in that. But I mean, I would say to myself that probably with supervision, I feel very much you've got to be there in person and constantly available.
Yes.
And so I have not really sort of put myself up. I mean, I'm available to assess theses and to co-supervise best as I can. But it's really more from the point of view of being sensitive to what students need.
Yes, no, that's a very good point.
And I think it's crucial that they have someone where they can go in through an open door and say, hey, last night I had this great idea. What do you think? Nah.
But again, electronically, it is actually easier than it ever was to do that sort of stuff. But it's still not the same as being able to wander down the corridor.
Don't forget how far we've come in the last couple of years in terms of saying how easy this is. I mean, you think that pre-COVID, the whole idea of these kinds of discussions and conferences, I mean, you might use Skype, and Skype was a bit clunky. I think if there is a silver lining to the pandemic cloud, it's actually been a far greater acceptance of how close we all are, you know, electrons wise. And I'm not saying this replaces the physical going out in the field with someone, because I always thought the most effective supervision I ever got or received was being in the field with a supervisor or with a mentor or a student and seeing things through their eyes and sharing your observations. But there are so many things that can be done, you know, in these virtual fora. I think we've got to use them all. We've got to use both the face-to-face and personal stuff, but also, you know, use Zoom or MS Teams or Skype, supplement journal articles with YouTube, you know, clips. I mean, all journals now ought to have, each article should have a brief little YouTube showing it all happening, and then, you know, the more dry verbal version or written version. There are lots of aspects of our technology that we could use to enrich, not replace the way in which we communicate.
I think you're right. Yeah, I think I don't know whether I'm just getting old and crusty or something, but I think enriching rather than replacing. I think there are a lot of really good things about, we shouldn't just throw the baby out with bathwater just because it's considered old technology, but we're all ways of doing things. But enriching.
Well, I look at your background behind you now, and there are lots of books and things like that. You know, nowadays there would be a lot of people who may be in their 20s and 30s would have the same amount of literature you have, but it's all stored in on the cloud or on their computer or whatever. We have changed a lot of the ways we do things technologically, but the fundamental skills of problem solving, of communication, of collaboration, of courtesy and compassion, those haven't changed at all.
No.
Somehow we've got to make sure we don't lose them in our enthusiasm to adopt, you know, technology that can facilitate stuff. And so there will always be these discussions. Well, will we ever have face-to-face conferences again, or will they all be done virtually or whatever? I'd love the idea that we could have both. And I think, in a way, there are a lot of the fundamental skills, which mean we will never be irrelevant. We'll always have these skills. But I also think back to, you know, getting my honours thesis typed by a professional typist, of, you know, the days before email, when the most exciting thing was a fax. And, you know, I remember Stuart Fisher joking about the fact that he would receive a fax, or the reply to a fax before he had sent it because of the time difference between the US and Australia. And I mean, you know, all of these kind of things that take a while to get one's head around, but really quite entertaining. And now we take it totally for granted that we can chat internationally without a lag or an echo. We can share screens, we can do all these incredible things.
Yeah, although one thing we did learn during COVID, because I play the cello and play in orchestras and things, and you realize that the perception about the non-lag and the reality is quite different. Trying to play in a group of musicians at the same time just doesn't work over Zoom, but everything else does. Look, I agree with you, and I think that's a nice way. I think a nice way to end. Thanks, Andrew, for finishing with that. That I like that in enriching, not necessarily replacing. Having the best of both worlds. I think that I agree. I think this has helped me, and I didn't know how I would do this a few years ago, and now I do. I think some of the meetings are better via Zoom than face to face, for sort of equity reasons in many cases. That we're on CSU is on many campuses, and now we can have these meetings, and there's no 10 people in one room and one person on the end of a phone anymore. It's wonderful.
But let's not underestimate the value of, you know, the tea room, or of a beer with friends and stuff like that. And I mean, you know, I think, yeah, it comes back to this.
Yeah, I think human nature. I mean, I think, you know, I even before COVID, I was amazed. I was constantly amazed that we would travel 36 hours just to spend a couple of days with somebody. Or, you know, when was it? 2008, I went to the US for the first time, and I landed in San Francisco, ended up in Texas, and I did most of it by train, not first class, but it was a sleeper. And I did that just to meet Kirk Weinmiller at Texas A&M University at College Station, and you know, I do it in a heartbeat. Even though it would take several days, I'd do it in a heartbeat. Because the difference between this and actually pressing the flesh and going out for a beer at some strange Texan bar with hundreds of beer on tap and rattlesnakes in cages on the bar, it was just a fantastic experience, which I would repeat it anytime. Thank you very much for talking. It's been wonderful to talk over your career to date. I do admire the fact that, you know, you did sort of retire when you did, because it's an unusual thing to do, and it's a brave thing to do, I think, and to be sort of allow things to fall out of the sky. I think it was also my experience has been similar. I don't know if I stopped working at the university now whether quite the same thing would happen, but anyway, it's nice to know that people can survive those sorts of situations. So thanks very much for talking, and
thank you.
Good luck with whatever falls out of the sky in the future.
Just checking.
See ya.
Thank you very much indeed, Paul. Good on you.